She thought the stable would keep her safe, until a cowboy said, "You'll sleep beside me or not at all." Subscribe now to see what happens next.
The desert was quiet that night, but not in the way that brings peace. It was the kind of quiet that carried weight, a silence stretched too thin, heavy with all the things that could not be heard, but were still out there, waiting. The stars burned bright above, endless and cold, and the moon cast its pale glow over a land that seemed empty of life. Only the wind moved, whispering across the scrub grass and rattling the dry boards of a fence long in need of repair. Out on that road, if you could even call it a road, came a figure moving slow, like every step was borrowed from a body too tired to keep going. She was alone. A woman where no woman should have been, walking the wastes with nothing but a torn dress, a pair of boots worn to the bone, and eyes that looked forward, because looking back meant remembering what followed. Her gait betrayed exhaustion, but also something more dangerous. Pride, the kind that holds a spine straight even when the world tries to break it. The ranch appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, a collection of wood and stone clinging stubbornly to the edge of nowhere. A house with shutters closed tight against the wind, a stable squatting beside it, and a stretch of land that looked both wild and wounded. The place was silent, but not empty. She knew, even before she reached the gate, that someone was watching. Inside the house, a man had been sitting by a low fire. He was not a man used to visitors, not anymore. His life had grown small, narrowed to chores and silence, to the steady company of his horses and the dogs that patrolled his yard. But those dogs had risen tonight, hackles raised, teeth bared toward the night. He had followed their growls to the door, shotgun balanced loosely in his hand. And there he saw her, a stranger framed in moonlight, standing at the gate like an omen carved out of dust. They stood staring at each other across that thin stretch of fence. He was broad-shouldered, his face carved with the hard lines of a man who had seen too much. She was thin, weary, but her chin lifted with a stubbornness that refused to beg. Neither spoke at first. The air between them stretched tight, like a rope pulled to breaking. Finally, her voice broke the silence. Rough, hoarse, touched with dust and thirst, but steady. She said she didn't want his house, didn't want his fire, nor his food, nor his company. She wanted the stable. A roof of wood, the smell of hay, the warmth of horses. That would be enough. She'd sleep there and be gone before the sun rose. The cowboy said nothing at first. He studied her the way he would study a wounded animal found limping through the desert. She had the look of someone hunted, the way her eyes darted once toward the horizon before locking back on him. Her sleeve was dark where blood had dried, her skin streaked with dirt and sweat. And yet, there was something unbroken in her, a fierceness, a fire that had not yet gone out, no matter how much the world had tried to snuff it. Most men would have turned her away. A stranger at night, carrying secrets in her silence, was a danger too great. But this man had lived long enough to know that sometimes danger looked less threatening than despair, and despair was exactly what lingered at the edges of her strength. He let her through. Not a word spoken, not a gesture of welcome, just the slow lowering of his shotgun and the faint nod of his head toward the stable. She walked past him without thanks, her boots crunching on the dirt, and vanished into the shadows of the barn. The man stayed outside a while longer. He stood with the shotgun resting against the fence post, his eyes on the horizon she had come from. Nothing moved there, but he felt it, the weight of whatever story she carried. The desert never sent souls wandering without reason. Inside the stable, the woman lowered herself onto the straw. It scratched her skin, filled her lungs with the smell of dust and horses, but it was shelter, and that was more than she had expected to find. Her body trembled with the release of walking too far, running too long. But even as her eyes closed, rest would not come easy. For in the silence of that barn, she could still hear them. Boots in the dirt, voices raised in cruelty, the echoes of men who would not stop searching. The ranch was quiet again, but beneath that quiet something dangerous was forming. A meeting had happened that was never meant to be. A solitary cowboy guarding his broken life, and a stranger who carried her pain like a wound she refused to show. Two shadows crossing paths under the silver eye of the moon. And before the night was over, before the desert gave way to dawn, both their lives would begin to change. The stable was not a place meant for comfort. Its walls were rough timber, scarred by years of weather and work, and the air inside was heavy with the musk of horses and the dry bite of hay. Yet for the woman who had walked so far, who had fled, farther still, it was shelter enough. She lay there, back pressed against the boards, breath shallow as she tried to quiet the storm that had carried her here. But silence can be cruel when you have nowhere to hide from memory. And in that silence, her body betrayed her. A cough tore through her chest, sharp and ragged, and when she pressed her hand to her side, it came away dark. Not fresh blood, old, half-dried, smeared across her palm. She had been hurt before she ever reached the ranch. Hurt badly. The cowboy knew it too. Though he had left her to the shadows, though his boots had carried him back across the yard and up the steps of his lonely house, he couldn't let her vanish from his mind. He found himself at the window, staring at the silhouette of the barn, one hand resting on the frame, the other still loose on the shotgun he hadn't thought to set down. The desert had taught him to trust his dogs, his guns, and his silence. But something in him refused to let this night pass without vigilance. Hours stretched thin. The fire inside his hearth sank to embers. The dogs curled and slept at his feet, restless in their dreams. Yet the man remained at the window, his thoughts circling back to the stranger. He tried to tell himself he didn't care, that she was only a shadow passing through, and by dawn she would be gone. But there was no denying what his eyes had seen. The torn sleeve, the tremor in her step, the kind of wounds a desert could not give but men could. He had known wounds like that. Sometime past midnight, he found himself walking back outside. The moon was higher now, sharp against the black sky, and the earth was silvered with its light. He crossed the yard with the slow, deliberate steps of a man, not sure why he was moving at all. His boots stirred the dust, his breath clouded in the chill, and when he reached the stable he hesitated. The door was half open, just enough for the wind to push it and make the hinges creak like an old voice. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The woman was awake. She sat with her back against the wall, one arm cradled against her side, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like two dark wells that had no bottom. She didn't speak, but she didn't look surprised to see him either. As though she had expected it, expected him to come, expected the silence to break. He noticed the blood before she could hide it, the smear on her hand, the torn cloth clinging to her ribs. It wasn't the kind of wound that killed fast, but it was the kind that poisoned slowly, like rust eating at steel. He stood there a long moment, jaw tight, then finally set the shotgun aside and crouched down, keeping his distance but close enough to see her clearly. She told him nothing, not yet. Her lips pressed tight, her shoulders stiff. But the silence between them was a language of its own. He saw the story written across her body, the chase, the violence, the way she carried herself as though the world had been trying to bury her alive and she had clawed her way back out. The cowboy didn't ask who had hurt her, not that night. He knew enough about cruelty to recognize its marks without needing names. Instead, he did something rarer for him. He spoke, and his voice was low, gravel scraped from years of disuse. He told her the truth, that a wound like hers couldn't be ignored. That if she thought she could disappear into the desert come morning, she was fooling herself. The land didn't forgive weakness. It swallowed it whole. She met his eyes then, and for the first time he saw the flicker of fear beneath her defiance. Not fear of him, but of what still hunted her. Because somewhere out there, beyond the edges of the ranch, there were men who would not stop. He could almost feel them in the air, riders moving through the dark, following the faint trail of a woman too strong to die and too stubborn to surrender. The cowboy felt something stir in him then, something he had long tried to bury beneath solitude. Anger, sharp and familiar. Anger not at her, but at whoever had put that fear in her eyes. He had seen it before, in another life, in faces he had failed to save. He leaned back, resting on his heels, and let the silence fall again. But this silence was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people tied together by a wound neither had chosen. The night pressed on, heavy and endless, and both of them knew the truth without saying it aloud. The desert was not done with her. And because she had come here, because fate had laid her path across his land, it was no longer done with him either. The desert has a way of carrying sound. Even the smallest stir, a coyote's call, the snap of a twig, travels far across the emptiness, carried on the wind until it reaches ears sharp enough to hear. And though the night still seemed calm, the cowboy felt it. A shift in the air, a heaviness that told him the world outside the stable was moving, changing. Somewhere out there, men were closing in. He had returned to his house after seeing the wound she tried to hide, but sleep refused him. The chair by the fire grew harder by the hour, the silence heavier with each breath. He stared at the walls, but his mind was not inside the house anymore. It was out there, circling around her. The woman with eyes that refused to break, even as her body betrayed her. Every so often, he rose to the window. The stable sat quiet, the lantern he had left burning inside, glowing faint against the dark. It should have been simple. A stranger had stumbled onto his land. He had given her shelter. By morning, she would be gone. That was the way the world worked, clean, detached, nothing lasting longer than it had to. But the desert didn't deal. In simple, it never had. When the dogs stirred again, their ears pricking toward the east, he knew. Riders, still far, still faint, but coming. The sound of hooves reached him not through his ears but through memory, the way the ground changes when hunted men draw near, the way silence breaks before the first gunshot. He strapped on his gun belt, the leather worn and cracked but still reliable, and stepped outside into the night. The cold struck him, sharp and dry, and the sky above seemed endless enough to swallow the ranch whole. He crossed the yard slow, his boots crunching against the dirt, and stopped at the stable door. For a long moment, he stood there, one hand resting on the wood as though deciding whether or not to open it. Inside, she was awake. He didn't need to see her to know it. Something about her presence filled the space, the same way a storm makes the air heavy before the first drop of rain. He pushed the door and found her sitting where he had left her, back straight against the wall, one hand pressed against her side. She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. It would have been easy to tell her the truth, that men were coming, that she had brought danger with her, that she needed to leave. But when the words formed in his mouth, they turned, bitter, unspeakable, because telling her to leave meant watching her walk into a death she couldn't outrun. And though he had lived most of his life turning his back on other people's burdens, something about this woman made that choice feel heavier than iron. Her eyes held his in the silence, dark, steady, refusing to plead but asking all the same. She didn't need to tell him who hunted her, nor what they had done. The blood on her sleeve told enough, the tremor in her breath told the rest. And still, she tried to carry it alone, tried to insist with her posture, with her chin raised against pain, that she didn't need saving. But he knew better. The desert. Only left two choices: stand and fight, or lie down and let the sand bury you. And this woman, for all her fire, didn't have much left to stand on. The weight of it pressed against him. For years, he had built his life small on purpose. No friends, no ties, no one left to lose. Solitude was safer, cleaner. He had told himself that enough times to believe it. But now, staring at her, he realized the lie. Because the moment she stepped through his gate, his solitude had cracked. And the sound of hooves in the distance told him it would soon be shattered. He lowered himself to a crouch, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. He didn't promise her safety. He wasn't the kind of man who made promises. But he did what he hadn't done in years. He gave her a choice. He told her she could run, take her chances with the desert, hope the men lost her trail. Or she could stay and let his fight become hers. For a long while, she didn't answer. Her hand tightened at her side, her lips pressed thin. And then, slowly, she shook her head. Not in refusal, but in resolve. She wasn't going anywhere. The cowboy felt something shift in him then, something dangerous. Because by letting her stay, he was binding himself to whatever blood followed. And blood never came without cost. Outside, the wind carried the sound of hooves again, closer now, faint but certain. The dogs growled low, teeth flashing in the dark. Dawn was still far away, but already the night had chosen its course. He rose, to his full height, hand brushing the worn grip of his revolver. The weight of it was familiar, like an old friend long avoided. He looked once more at the woman, at the fire still alive in her eyes despite the shadows around her, and he understood what the desert had delivered to his gate. Not a burden, not a stranger, but a reckoning. And when the riders came, they would find not a woman broken and running, but a man who had decided, finally, to stand. The first light of dawn had not yet touched the horizon when the riders came. The sound of hooves rolled low and steady, like distant thunder. Dust rose behind them, though the night still cloaked their faces in shadow. There were at least 5, maybe more. Men who rode with the confidence of wolves closing in on prey, they thought already broken. The dogs barked, teeth bared toward the east. The horses in the stable shifted nervously, hooves striking the floor, breath snorting in agitation. The woman pressed her back harder against the wall, her hand trembling against her ribs. She could hear them too, the men who had hunted her across the desert, men whose cruelty had carved scars into her skin and fear into her heart. The cowboy stepped out into the yard. His boots sank into the dirt, his hat brim low, his revolver heavy at his hip. The lantern light flickered behind him, spilling from the stable door, painting him half in shadow, half in fire. He did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, calm, the way a man moves when he knows running is useless and standing is all that's left. The riders slowed as they neared the fence. Their horses snorted, restless, as if they knew the land they stepped onto was not theirs. One of the men called out, his voice sharp, carrying through the dry air. He demanded the woman, said she belonged to them, said the cowboy had no business, sheltering what wasn't his. The cowboy did not answer at first. He let the silence hang, thick and dangerous. Then he lifted his head, his voice low, rough as gravel, but clear enough to carry. He told them the woman would not leave with them, not now, not ever. For a moment, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the men laughed, a cruel, ugly sound that echoed across the open ground. They thought they had found just another rancher, some lonely fool whose courage would shatter the moment steel was drawn. But the cowboy's hand was already resting on his revolver, and his eyes were steady, cold, the eyes of a man who had walked through fire before and never forgotten the heat. The first shot broke the night. A crack of thunder, the flash of gunpowder. One rider fell from his saddle before he could even draw. The horses reared, chaos spreading like wildfire, and then the desert exploded with gunfire. The cowboy moved with the precision of someone who had buried too many ghosts. Each pull of the trigger was deliberate, each step measured. Dust rose around him, mixing with smoke, with the stench of iron as blood hit the dirt. He took a shot to the shoulder, the force staggering him, but he did not fall. Pain only sharpened. Drove him forward. From the stable, the woman watched, torn between fear and awe. She saw a man not just fighting, but choosing to bleed, to stand, to carry her burden as if it were his own. Every shot he fired was a promise, every body that fell a word carved into that promise. The riders were skilled, but they had underestimated him. 2 more dropped, clutching their chests, the dust swallowing them whole. The others pressed harder, circling, trying to break his stance. One charged with a knife, closing the distance. The cowboy met him head-on, steel against steel, the blade slashing across his arm, but his revolver found the man's throat before the knife could find his heart. The desert was alive with violence, and then, just as sudden, it was quiet again. The last rider lay in the dirt, breath rattling out of him as the cowboy stood above, chest heaving, shirt torn and soaked with blood. The dogs circled the yard, barking, tails stiff, but there was no one left to fight. The cowboy staggered, his hand pressed against the wound in his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. For a moment, he thought he might fall. But then he saw her, standing in the doorway of the stable now, her body trembling, but her eyes locked on him. And in those eyes, he saw not fear, but something else. Something fierce. She stepped toward him, slow at first, then faster, until she was at his side. She caught his arm as he swayed, her grip tighter than he expected from someone so worn. He looked down at her, at the woman who had arrived as a shadow at his gate, and realized the truth. She had not been meant to break, and neither had he. The sun was finally rising. Its light stretched across the desert, spilling over the bodies. Scattered in the dirt, over the man who had chosen to stand, and the woman who had refused to surrender. Together, they were covered in blood, in dust, in silence, but alive. The cowboy let the weight of his revolver fall back into its holster. His voice was hoarse, nearly gone, but steady. He told her the stable was no place for her. Not anymore. She would not sleep alone. Not in the dark, not in the cold. Not while he still breathed. And for the first time since she had stepped onto his land, her shoulders loosened. She did not argue. She did not defy. She only nodded, her hand still holding him upright as they walked back toward the house. Behind them, the desert carried its dead. Ahead of them, a silence that was no longer empty, but full, with the weight of survival, of choices made, of something fragile and dangerous growing between 2 people who had nothing left but each other. And so, when dawn came to that lonely ranch, it did not find a stranger sleeping in a stable. It found a woman standing beside a man who had bled for her, and a man who had finally let someone inside the walls he had built around his heart. The desert, as always, demanded its price. But this time, it had given something back. The dawn broke pale that morning, as if even the sun was afraid to shine on what had been left behind. The night had been long, soaked in gunpowder and blood, and now only silence remained. The ranch lay in ruins. The stable smoldered in slow burning. Embers, carrying the smell of scorched wood and frightened horses. The wind dragged the dust across the yard, painting over the stains of red as if trying to hide the truth of what had happened. He stood with his rifle leaning against him, hat pulled low, his face shadowed by exhaustion. She sat on the porch, steps, a blanket around her shoulders, staring at nothing. Her eyes were still caught somewhere between survival and disbelief. They hadn't spoken much since the last shot had echoed into the desert. There was no need. Words would only cheapen what they both knew, that death had come knocking, and together they had slammed the door in its face, but death never leaves empty-handed. The cowboy's hands trembled as he poured water into a tin cup. He set it beside her, and though she did not look up, she reached for it, her fingers brushing his. A simple touch, but in the aftermath of carnage, it felt like a vow. Behind them, the bodies of men who had thought themselves hunters now lay sprawled in the dust. The coyotes would come before long. The earth itself would swallow the truth. But between the two of them, the memory would never fade. She finally spoke, her voice raw, almost breaking. "I never asked for this fight, but I knew they wouldn't stop." He sat beside her, slow and heavy, like a man who carried too many ghosts already. "They never do," he said. His voice was low, hoarse. "But they won't come for you again, not while I'm still breathing." For the first time, she turned to look at him. There was no fear now, only something deeper. Recognition. She saw in him the same brokenness that lived in her, the same fire that refused to die even when the world tried to snuff it out. The sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows across the battered ranch. From the road, it would look like just another lonely homestead on the edge of nowhere. But inside its ruins, two people sat close, bound not by choice, but by survival, and by something else neither dared to name. The cowboy adjusted his hat and let out a slow breath. "You can stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't pity. It was simply truth. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was acceptance, as heavy and certain as the desert sky, and as the wind carried away the smoke, they remained there together, two souls scarred, two souls alive. No promises, no future written, only the ashes of dawn, and the fragile, stubborn spark of something beginning again.